You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Dr. Robin DeRosa. Robin is the editor of Hybrid Pedagogy journal and a professor at Plymouth State University. Today, Robin and I are discussing the promise and challenge of HyFlex, teaching and learning in a hybrid and flexible manner. How can a course be taught well with some students online and some in the classroom? Robin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
It's my pleasure. So, Robin, how do you define HyFlex teaching?
A couple of things to say about that. The first is that most of us who have been talking, particularly since the pandemic, about HyFlex are informed by the work of Brian Beatty, who I think is the one who coined the term long before COVID was on the scene, and was just interested in the fact that we had face-to-face classes, we had online classes, we had blended and hybrid classes. But for the most part, people hadn't been doing simultaneously dual modality classes, online and face-to-face at the same time. So he'd done some work on that, which I think in general didn't have a significant uptake until COVID hit. And then suddenly everyone was looking for options. And so his work was sort of rediscovered. In the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative, where I work at Plymouth State, when COVID hit and we started learning more about HyFlex, which generally stands for hybrid flexible teaching, we actually adjusted the definition a little bit. So we now think of it in my lab as highly flexible teaching. So we spell high with an HI instead of an HY. And this comes from my colleague, Martha Burtis. And we've been looking less at some of the regimented definitions of HyFlex and more about what can we do if we think about modality more flexibly. So not necessarily that you need to do both at once all the time, but that we can move in and out of online and face-to-face modalities as we need to.
So I love that, because one of the things that struck me about HyFlex, the way it's sort of strictly defined, is it's anywhere, but not anytime. And a lot of the technologies that we're applying have in the past been applied to make it so that you take your classes asynchronously, right? So you've been looking at the whole continuum. What are some of the themes that emerge from that?
Yeah, that's great. And one of the first things I want to say is I think since probably everybody who's in higher ed has been doing some HyFlex teaching through the pandemic, even those who are really, strictly face-to-face folks before. And I just don't know a single faculty member who came out of that experience saying, wow, that's really fantastic. That really worked great. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that when you become really good at online teaching, one of the things you realize is that you don't just take a face-to-face environment and stick it online. You don't just put it in your learning management system. Lots of us use Canvas or Moodle or whatever. But that what happens is you learn that you have to design differently for online environments. And then those of us who teach online realize you have to design really differently for synchronous online environments and asynchronous online environments. So one of the problems with HyFlex is that it's asking you to teach simultaneously, really in three modalities: asynchronous online, synchronous online, and face-to-face, all at the same time, when we know that best practice tells us that you should design very differently for all three of those environments. So one of the things that we're thinking about in the collab is, okay, let's take the gift of HyFlex, which is really the recognition that sometimes the reality of being human means that you need flexibility in your modality. And that goes from everything from a global pandemic where You could literally get infected with a virulent virus if you go in a room with other people.
Yeah.
But it could also be other things. It could, I worked with a college in California before COVID, and they had immediately gone all online because their campus was practically on fire. And so they had sent everybody home. And the question was, do we need to just stop learning now? What do we do? We also have individual students who, for example, suffer from a chronic illness or a catastrophic injury or illness, or are grieving from a parent, or have mental illnesses, or all sorts of challenges that can impact their ability to participate in certain ways. So the beauty of HyFlex is that we recognize that stuff and we say, if it's good for you, we want to help you keep learning through these challenges. But on the other side, I think the problem with HyFlex is when we just say, we can continue learning as if nothing is different. We can just shove it online and be done. So highly flexible learning, as opposed to hybrid flexible learning, is more about thinking about the context in which you're in and making modality decisions based on that. So one suggestion we've had for faculty is, design certain face-to-face experiences when that makes sense. So for example, when it can be safe, when you are doing something experiential and hands-on, when you are out in the field. For example, at Plymouth State, we were able to pretty safely do field experiences where people were out in the rivers taking water samples, and even masked or not, they were able to be pretty safe during COVID, but they couldn't go into their classrooms to do other things that were very easy to move online.
Right.
So I think for us, the issue is really intentional design and recognizing human challenge. And if you do those two things, then HyFlex, becomes a way of talking about that and a way of coming up with more options for yourself as a designer.
There are implications for the working world as well, right? I mean, the same challenges that we have in higher ed or even regular ed, we have at work. So the skills that you're generating and the involvement that the students have, that's useful in the working world, one would think as well, right?
I think so. And, I will just point out that in addition to being in higher ed, I'm also in the working world, right? So I have a job with students, but I also, run a lab where we have staff. And one of the lessons we took from the pandemic, which I think many companies are learning now, is that some things work especially well face-to-face, and some things work much better asynchronously online or synchronously online. For example, we've moved certain kinds of meetings to Zoom, really, even if we're all in the office, because we realize we can much more easily share links, work on shared electronic documents together. So I think, again, the question that I ask of supervisors in the workplace, or that I would ask of students, is to recognize that technology has affordances and limitations depending on what you're doing. And I think in some ways technology can sometimes, it sometimes is a barrier to human connection, and sometimes it's really a great way for humans to connect. So I think you need to look at the particular circumstances, and you also really need to look at people's access too, right? So with both your company or your students, you have to think about not just what devices do they have, but what are their broadband connections? What's their home work environment like? Where are they going to feel safest and more comfortable? And those things change a lot. For some people, it's a real gift to be home. We certainly had students for whom that was a real challenge. We had faculty sort of saying, if you don't turn your cameras on Zoom, it's so alienating. But for students, it was very alienating to turn a camera on and show that they didn't really have a great place. They had to be maybe in their bed, or their family members were there, or it just wasn't an appropriate professional environment. So really what we advocate for is know the humans that you're working with, listen to the humans that you're working with about their needs and try to use technology to meet those needs. And that's really designing around people rather than designing around the tools. So it's hard to make rules for everybody because it really depends on what you're trying to achieve and who you're working with.
So, okay, a couple of confessions. One, I want to pull on that thread you raised about meetings, because that's a universal experience, like it or not. I mean, a class is basically a meeting in many ways. And also, my role where I work at York University is in technology. So one of the reasons I'm curious to speak with you is to get a handle on what technology these classrooms and these students will require. So let's look at meetings, for example, because my son briefly attended school during COVID. And so he was part of the studio audience, right? And he found that it was way better to be in the home audience because they were playing to Moodle or whatever technology they were using. Have you come to any conclusions about how to make it so that if you have people, a HyFlex meeting, how do you make that function? Do you have any tips like socially or technologically that would make that smooth?
Yeah, you mean if you really are doing classic HyFlex?
Like I have 10 people in the room and 10 people at home, and I'm trying to run a meeting or a class.
So, and I can also supply you with some resources that we created on these ideas in the collab. So we have, some short webinars about how to handle these things. Some of it's informed by Beatty's work. Other stuff is just things that, we put together as we were dealing. But one of the key things, and I think this is you mentioned the studio audience effect. One thing so when COVID hit, one of the first things that my university did, like many universities across the country, is they quickly outfitted a whole bunch of rooms. They call them now Zoom-enabled classrooms, and they've got the cameras up and the ability to, just one-click project. And that seemed great until you actually experience what it's like to be online in one of those Zoom-enabled classrooms, because really what happens is you're sort of sitting in the back with this very unengaged perspective of the back of your peers' heads.
Yeah.
You can't really see the whiteboard or the blackboard effectively, and then the poor professor who maybe has never done this before is trying to deal, So the first thing you really want to think about is, how do you design for both of those environments at once? So a couple of possibilities. One is, and this might start by sounding funny, even the people in the classroom can have laptops in front of them so that they are projected. You just deal with the audio so you don't get double echoes. But that way the people online and the people in the classroom all have the ability to see each other more effectively. And that way you can zoom in really well on the professor or the board, as opposed to just that giant view of the whole class. When you're doing group work and stuff, it's pretty easy because you just pull you can make your groups on Zoom really quickly, and then the people who are face-to-face can have their work. Another thing to consider is, instead of using the board for everything, if you're using that whiteboard in Zoom, people can all be contributing into that document or into a Google Doc. So the students who are there are still getting the feel of the room. They're still having the professor right there. They're still talking with each other, but everybody's able to connect to a similar technology. Another idea is really to consider having co-pilots. So if you are the professor and you're sort of focused on your face-to-face classroom, who's somebody in the room? And of course, you could transfer this throughout different students, but you could have both an online student and a face-to-face student who are designated as the co-pilots. So they're doing things like watching the chat and communicating those questions, summarizing things that are happening online, checking in with the online audience, sort of the way a TA might, does anyone here have questions, or what do you think? They can even be specifically calling out people in the chat, hey, Tim, what do you think about that? So they can have a whole back channel happening. But if you distribute the responsibility for that, the professor doesn't have to do everything. We definitely heard from faculty that it's real. I mean, even for folks like me who pretty much work in these environments all the time, it's impossible to attend to the face-to-face room and the online stuff all at the same time and do both well. So you just make your decisions and make sure everybody's cared for. The other part is, and Beatty has some great resources in his open access book about HyFlex, is that when you're designing your courses, so most faculty, either you're old school and you're really making like a plan on a piece of paper, or you're kind of winging it. You still have a plan for your class, 15 minutes of group work and then this lecture and then what. As you're planning that, you really need to augment your plan to consider modality. So you have to break your plan up and say, for online synchronous folks, for face-to-face folks, for asynchronous folks, so that you make sure that whatever you're designing works well in those modalities. And then I think the last thing I'll say is that we started thinking less about classes as sort of traditional courses, and we started thinking more in a HyFlex environment about scheduling events for the week. So this week, instead of having your Tuesday and Thursday class from 9:30 to 11:45 or whatever, this week, we're going to have one synchronous session on Tuesday from 9:30 to 11:45. Here's the asynchronous work that's going to happen. Here's a online lecture that you need to watch, and respond to. And you can make these a suite of choices. So people can kind of pick and choose, okay, I have to get the content. So I have to do, at least one thing out of the group A options. But it may be the case that people need to, move in and out of those experiences a little bit. So if you design for different experiences, the students can pick what they're doing. So think of it a little bit more like event planning and a little bit less like, traditional seat time for courses. And I think that works well. It allows you to still do field experiences. For example, if you're doing a field experience and you're doing water table stuff, maybe somebody's got COVID, they can't come, they're quarantined for 10 days. Well, have a student wear a GoPro out on the field experience. Their job is to be the eyes and ears of the person in quarantine. And then the person in quarantine, they choose for that week to watch the video as opposed to showing up for the field experience. So I think you have to think a little bit about multiple ways that people can receive content and try to design engaging experiences for the different modalities that are at your service.
So I love that. I want to pull on that was all great, but the idea of a co-pilot I thought was really interesting because you could distribute that amongst the class. That could be your participation grade.
Absolutely.
Right. And what a formative experience to be along next to the teacher in a way, as opposed to, in the class. I think that's wonderful.
Absolutely. And I think it's really hard for people who are, almost all of us are experiencing new challenges in modality now. Even if you've, been an online teacher, you've probably never been an online teacher during a pandemic. So things are shifting. And I think a great thing to do is to be upfront with your students about the experiment that we're all engaged in now, because the cool thing about what we're doing, we're not just surviving this pandemic, we're trying to refigure higher education in a way that potentially could offer us some better options for after COVID. Let's hope there is an after COVID.
Yes.
So if that's the case, I think the best thing is to be honest with students. Hey, we're charting some new territory here. You can be a part of figuring out how we can use modality to make higher education more humane in a post-COVID world. I just think about two students I have now who are fighting cancer. If COVID ends, they may still have ongoing challenges. And some of what I learn about modality flexibility could help them continue to learn if they'd like to during their chemo treatments. So telling students, hey, we don't have the answers yet because this is, really kind of cutting edge redevelopment. allows you to fail a little bit more, allows them to offer more input, and I think can make you feel less nervous about taking risks, because nobody really knows how to do this perfectly.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've noticed in my university community is it really has felt like faculty, staff, and students are on this side looking at the problems caused by COVID on that side. Like we're together in this. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to, as people get exhausted with the whole inconvenience and fear, that'll wane, I'm sure. But for now, at least, it really feels like there's a togetherness. So to be able to admit that, look, I don't know everything, help me out here, is a great way to start.
Absolutely. I mean, I know lots of students who are, especially gamers, spend a lot of time on Discord, and they come into a Zoom environment sometimes, and it feels sort of Jurassic because they're used to the ability to be sort of HyFlexy in some ways, with total multimedia capability. And so some faculty who've really listened to their students have started experimenting with other environments like Discord. And I know I've been a part of a couple of academic conferences now that are using Discord because they couldn't meet face-to-face because of the pandemic, and because they were listening to a new generation of people who had ways of communicating. Obviously, when people are overwhelmed, you don't want to toss millions of new technologies at them. But the fact of the matter is there are creative ways out there. And if you don't know them, it doesn't mean they don't exist. So the first thing you need to say is, gosh, here's the challenge. Who can help me? And you have academic technologists, but you also have students. And a lot of students will come up with, I think, some pretty good ideas about how this experiment could unfold. And maybe one last thing I'll say in terms of student input is there is a caveat. The very few studies that are out there about HyFlex, a couple of them, for example, and this is no surprise to faculty because we've all seen it. If you offer a course HyFlex, especially in a residential college like my own, for example, students will start off telling you that they definitely learn better in a face-to-face environment and that they prefer it. But by the end of the semester, even though they'll continue to claim that, they will be selecting the online modality more often because it's convenient, and we all understand that. So you kind of have this challenge, which is that the flexibility and convenience of online is very seductive and helpful, but sometimes students are not feeling like it's good for their learning compared to the face-to-face environment. So, and faculty get frustrated because they end up preparing these HyFlex environments. They got one student in the classroom, 20 online. It's awkward. It's difficult. So it's something to think about. And I think there's a couple of ways around that. The first is save up your face-to-face things for things that really need to be face-to-face, and see if you can get them to come, especially if you're at a residential college where people can come safely. Make those online experiences those face-to-face experiences times when it really makes sense to be face-to-face, right? We're going to do something. But the other is, the message is students like online learning. They like flexibility. We need to up our game a little bit. We can't just take the same old lecture and project it. When they sit on Zoom for an hour and listen to you talk and you're not checking in, and they're checking out. Yeah. So you've got to learn from people who are good at teaching online, and people who are good at teaching online will laugh, if you tell them that people don't engage in online environments, right?
Yeah.
Because
you can't tell sometimes too.
That's right.
Yeah.
Especially if you're used to taking all your cues from a face, and you've got those black boxes in front of you, and everything as a face-to-face teacher about measuring engagement comes from body language and facial expressions and nodding and the ability to call on someone who seems maybe like they're not paying attention. And Suddenly you've got none of that. So you've got to figure out, are you using polling? Are you using the chat? Are you using Mentimeter or other tools like that? Do you have interactive H5P technology that's allowing them to come into your stuff? Are you chunking up your recordings? I mean, all the stuff that people know who do instructional design for online environments.
So you remind me of a prof, and this was long ago. This is, I think, over a decade. She was saying that whenever she turned off the lights to do a comparison between two bits of art on projectors, the whole classroom was just a sea of Apple symbols, Apple logos lit, from the laptops lit from the other side. And it made me think of what you were describing with everybody having a laptop, but actually being in the classroom. When you raised the idea of Copilot, it made me wonder if you could make maybe duos or trios of somebody in the class and somebody at home, or even if that's happening organically. I mean, maybe they're discording and it's not official, right? And they're saying, I can't read the board. What the hell's going on in class there? You can say, oh, well, it don't worry about it. It's in the book or whatever, you can communicate. But the problem is it's so hard for the prof to know if they're really engaged or if they're just talking about last night's game.
Well, we're very afraid as professors of the back channel, right? For good reasons, but we're still in an era where professors make students drop their cell phones in a cardboard box on the way into class. And this is pretty hard if you are teaching, say, online or HyFlex, because the first thing you've got to do is trust your students with the whole world in front of them as a portal. So you're going to have to design for people who have access to every other thing in the world. Yeah. And the question is, why do they want you? Right. And I personally feel like if you're a professor, that's kind of your job, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of saying it's on the student, I think it's really on our design, to figure out how that happens. And one of the best ways is to just have continuing interaction, right? To limit the amount of time that passes where they're not asked to create, produce, engage, reflect, and instead just absorb. And that probably makes sense in a world where the internet's always available, because there's too much information to become an absorber. You have to learn all the time to be reflecting, to be curating, to be, participating. So I think online learning offers us a new way to think about participatory learning. And so we really have to design for that kind of interaction. In a face-to-face environment, it's easier to use policing to do that. And one of the first things that happened during COVID is we tried to take that policing and move it online, right? Yeah. Here's remote proctoring. We're scanning your eyeballs, don't look away. And I find that troubling on so many levels. First of all, depending on who you are, your relationship to surveillance could be very traumatic and very vexed. So particularly students of color, students with disabilities, students with anxiety, these are very hard environments for learning when you feel surveilled. But second of all, it's not going to work. Every surveillance mechanism is going to create a market for how to get out of being
defeating
right?
it.
Yeah. What's the point? We want learning, we don't want compliance.
Bravo.
So I think, that's the challenge, is how do we design for engagement through a screen? And, luckily people know how to do that, right?
Yeah. So I know in many circles, and quite possibly yours, learning styles is a controversial term. Some people dispute if there is such a thing, but there's certainly different, I think you're using the term modalities to describe how you teach in class versus online versus both versus asynchronously. And whether we call that a learning style or not, individual students are going to gravitate towards one or the other. Do you have any thoughts on whether that should be catered to, or if it really should be solely about circumstance? What are you looking at with that? And how do you advise students to recognize which they're better at.
Yeah, well, and students are really pretty good at that already. Like when they come in to my office as advisees to register, I mean, many of them will be like, I cannot take an online class. Like it will not work for me. Although sometimes you wonder if that's just because they've taken really poor online classes. So I doubt, I definitely dispute the idea of learning styles, and I doubt there's anyone who can't learn online or who is fully better face-to-face. But just think of yourself, as a working person. I know there are differences in preferences. For example, I am on a strategic planning committee right now. I'm sure that sounds like great fun to everyone. You've all been there. And I just can't fathom, it's all faculty and staff for the most part. And I can't fathom it, but I'm the only one who wants to meet online. Everybody else wants a Friday afternoon face-to-face meeting to do strategic planning. And I literally think they're nuts. So the fact is, like, people do have different preferences. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that. I think the better way to make decisions, though, is to look at the content of whatever it is that you're doing and the circumstances of the people who need to do it and make decisions that way. Preference is a part of circumstances, so for example, if somebody has to commute an hour through the snow, they might prefer to do strategic planning online. And I think that's, so preferences are valid. So I don't have a problem with that. The other thing is, we know that higher ed is changing shape a little bit. Students are, just in order to, like, my public institution is about 9% funded by the state of New Hampshire, the cost of attending. The rest is all borne by tuition. So most of my students are working, to pay the bills for college. It's different than that was, in the 60s, in the 70s, when people say, oh, I worked my way through college. Yeah, you had a 10-hour-a-week job, and it paid for the whole year. So I think we also know that, the average age of students is changing. We have more adult learners who may have kids. And so there's a lot of good reasons to care about preference beyond just, oh, this person's, picky. So I absolutely think it's great to think about context and circumstance along with, what works best for the content that you're teaching.
So I've seen you I think it was in one of the podcasts you did, you advise faculties to focus on their instructional missions when designing any course. How can they do that with HyFlex? Like, what is the connection between the subject matter and how you teach it?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a couple different questions there, but the first part, I think, about institutional mission is kind of a thing I've been harping on lately. Like, first of all, I like faculty to think about what is the purpose of your institution. And sometimes you have a mission statement that will help you with that. Sometimes your mission statement is garbage. It's just, the purpose is learning. And, it's not targeted enough. But at least in my institution, we're a public institution. We serve pretty much a rural community in a northeastern state. And we have particular things in our mission statement that are important to us about access, about the state workforce, about diversity, about a whole bunch of things. And a lot of times that strategic planning, that institutional mission has no connection to course design. That's like a thing that provosts deal with. It's a thing that student life deals with, the admissions office looks at. But my question is, how could, I'm a faculty member, so I'm probably biased when I say that teaching and learning is pretty core to higher education. It's like maybe the most important thing about higher education.
I'm staff. I'll concede that point.
I thank you. Thank you. So if that's the case, we really should see our mission statements reflected in our course designs. So one of the things I encourage faculty to do is to take a look at what your strategic priorities are about. Are they about retention? If they are, what are the retention problems at your institution? Is it, for example, students don't have the ability to pay and they're leaving because they can't afford to stay? Is the retention issue about how they're able to take their classes and fit them in with their lives? Is it about the fact that there's gateway courses that they're not making their way through? Is it that that they're not well prepared when they come into college? Is it their first semester that's tanking them out? Whatever those things are, the answer to all those questions creates different goals, I think, in a course. So I would suggest that teaching and learning centers and instructional designers start looking at those statements and helping faculty build for what it is that you're, not only this, but at least partially for what it is that your institution is trying to do. If public access to knowledge as a public institution is important, then, how are we sharing that knowledge out? How are faculty members publishing their work? How is our research helping our communities? So I think HyFlex can be part of a lot of those conversations. I think the main reason we moved to HyFlex during the pandemic was about retention. We just thought, if we don't do this, people are going to drop out. We can't retain them. So that's a big part of things. But in a post-pandemic world, we want to ask those same questions. How can HyFlex affect who's able to enroll, who's able to be retained? What about diversity and equity, and how can HyFlex help? And how can HyFlex and online modalities sometimes hinder that stuff? One of the things we had to talk a lot about here was we moved in a lot of programs to open educational resources, free, openly licensed digital resources, which is great, lowers the cost of college by a lot of money. But also, you better make sure your students have access to devices and broadband, because now the free textbook is online, right? So these are complicated conversations, and they can't just happen at strategic planning levels. They have to happen with faculty and designers and technologists inside of our courses as well.
Most universities are nonprofit, and man, they prove it every day, right? We don't make a lot of money, and yet it costs a lot of money to do the things that we're talking about. All this technology is expensive. And so how is it justified? Because I know you've kind of gone into that a little bit, but I mean, part of me is looking for a soundbite, because I
got a soundbite for you, Tim.
Okay, all right.
I'm Googling it right now. Hold on. Your guests will hear me
typing away,
because I want to get the stat for you, and I'll see if I can do it this fast.
So while you're doing that, let me just sort of frame the question a little bit more, and that is, are we hoping that all this technology we're putting in classrooms will lower costs and raise productivity, or is it really about the outcomes? Is there a measurable improvement to outcomes that we're looking for?
So that's a great question. And also the word productivity is so interesting when we're talking like what are we producing? It's definitely not widgets, right? So we need to think maybe more complicatedly about ROI when we're talking about universities. But here's the soundbite I was looking for. It just came out. Actually, the particular one I found is dated today, but I think the study came out yesterday. Here's the headline: South Dakota public higher education drives $2.1 billion of state's economy in South Dakota and sustains more than 12,000 jobs. So what I want to say about this, Tim, is that it's a myth. It's disinformation that public higher education is expensive. Public higher education is pretty much the best ROI that we have, even if you just want to look at cash, which, to me is not the only measure. There may be some public goods that actually decrease revenues, but for example, keep you alive, right? Like public health measures, you might say, well, we are going to lose 100 million a year, but at least we won't die. That's worth it.
Sure.
Public higher education is actually incredible, because not only is it delivering benefits like lowering crime rates, producing happier citizens, more people who vote, lowering mortality rates, increasing the cognitive abilities of the children of people who go to college, increasing the productivity of a whole region, whether or not all of those people go to college. So we've got all these sort of non-market benefits, but the market benefits of public higher education are well proven. States in particular are getting, so I think taxpayers are getting about a 10% ROI on public education, and states themselves are getting, I think, about 3.1%. This is data from Philip Trostel, who's an economist in Maine. So one of the challenges we have when we talk about like, it's so expensive, how are we going to do it, is helping people understand that we don't understand the economics of public goods very, very well. We are in a privatized economy, and the way we talk about the economy is the rhetoric is also privatized. So we assume that common goods and public goods are nothing but a drain. But that's a myth. And even if you just want to look at it economically. So, it's endlessly frustrating to me that my state is investing only 9% of our operating budget because there's nothing else in the state that's giving back to our economy the way we are. And I don't know, if we're gonna survive, not just COVID, which cost my state system, I think, about $50 million extra dollars last year, but just the continuing divestment that's been happening since the recession in 2008, where most states have not built back their higher ed investments despite what's coming back. So in general, I like to just change the terms of the debate and say, not so much how are we going to pay for it, but why aren't we? Why aren't we paying for it?
So I raised the word productivity. I do realize that's also a controversial term, but nobody wants their productivity measured, but we certainly want ourselves to be personally more productive. And so do you have any advice for a faculty member who finds them teaching maybe 2, 3, 4 different ways, the same class? Yeah. Do you have any advice for them on how to keep it so it doesn't make them crazy and keep them up till 1 a.m?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great point. And the first is, this is kind of why my lab moved away from HyFlex learning in its classic sense, because you have to acknowledge that faculty are basically designing for 3 modalities at once. It's in many ways close to 3 times the work to teach that way. It was probably okay for that emergency remote semester. We burned ourselves out, but we were just doing what we could. In the long term, this is not a sustainable way to teach, I don't think, because either you're going to cut corners and design for just one modality and the people in the other modalities are going to get shafted, or you're going to, burn yourself out because you're just working too much, particularly when, call it roughly half of our professoriate is contingent and they're getting paid $3,500, $250 an hour or whatever to teach this class, right? It's too much to ask of faculty. So that's why I suggest thinking more about highly flexible and when can you use modalities to do different kinds of things. So you don't always need, every Tuesday and Thursday or every Monday, Wednesday, Friday to be offering everything to everybody. So it might be that one class is a truly HyFlex class. There's a recorded lecture, so you're breaking it up. So you're not teaching everything all the time. And I think you can get the hang of doing that. But really the other thing I would suggest is talking with your instructional designers, because there are people who spend more time than faculty thinking about how to solve challenges like that. And a partnership between a designer and a faculty member can be a good way to really predict what your workload is going to look like and adjust it accordingly. But it may be that old measures of seat time need to go more out the window, which they kind of already have with online learning. I mean, it's just stupid, right? Like, so people probably need to, you might have your class scheduled Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, 9 to 10. It might be that you're no longer showing up Fridays, 9 to 10, because certain things have moved asynchronously. So we do have some things to work with. And I think schools and accreditors, need to get a little more open-minded. I think accreditors have come a long way since COVID started, realizing that flexibility, it's going to be, we don't necessarily want to go back, to being less flexible. So we're going to have to think more about learning outcomes and less about inputs, probably.
Yeah, I think that idea of alternating between in-person and online, and then having the other group treated as an asynchronous experience, that's inspired, right? That at least you're only designing three 1/3 classes or whatever, right? So the problem is, and you sort of hinted at this, is that some institutions are saying, no, it's bums and seats, right?
Well, yeah, and it's so funny because at least I think lots of faculty are feeling this. They before COVID, lots of residential schools in particular were in this push to go online because it was like, online's the future. We're going to get new markets, new enrollments. Then COVID hit, lots of people went online and people were like, we got to get back in the classroom.
We didn't even that much. No.
It's always, the grass is always greener for the administration, on the other side. But the reality is again, not an either or. So I think we can use what we've learned through COVID to become better at online and also maybe better able to reach more learners than we could before. But in COVID, we also recognized for some of us who teach in residential colleges that there are certain gifts that you get when you're able to come together in face-to-face environments, right? It's going to be very hard to replace going out to the marsh and doing water samples in a group with partners. And so there's benefits to both, and it will depend on your demographic and your opportunities.
Let's say your best friend who's about to teach comes to you and says, they say I have to do HyFlex. And so you sit them down and you say, okay, well, this is what you want to insist on, the technology in the class and the support you get. Describe that. What technology and what support would you give somebody who's just embarking on HyFlex for the first time?
So the first is, I would definitely start with the second, which is support. The most places, when they're trying to figure out what faculty need to go HyFlex, start with the technology. And you don't really need a lot of technology to go HyFlex. You need a ton of support, though. And I think this is what bit a lot of us in the pencil, during COVID, is that we all had a lot of technology and not very much support. Mm-hmm. And as a result, for a lot of people, it was the worst teaching experience they've had. People were not coming out of that first HyFlex semester going, awesome. So the main thing I think people need, if they're going to teach HyFlex, number one is permission to use their own expertise as teachers to redefine what HyFlex means. We have online, we have face-to-face, we have both at once. You don't have to actually do any of those. You can think about your discipline and your students. So now if I tell you that online teaching is a continuum, not a choice between modalities, I want to give you permission to use your own expertise to use that continuum as wisely as possible. And that's why people need support. They need teaching and learning centers, they need instructional designers, and they need technologists to walk them through that journey of designing for their discipline and for their demographic. Once faculty have a sense of like, yes, here are the things I know, I really need to try hard to keep face-to-face. here's some things I could move asynchronously. Like, actually, why was I even wasting my class time? It's flipped classroom stuff, right? Why was I sucking up my class time with this stuff that's better off asynchronously?
This is something from your book. Yeah.
Right. And here's something that works great synchronously online, because we're all going to be on a Google Doc together doing, certain things, and that's going to work even better than sitting in a classroom. Once they've got that sort of scripted out in their heads a little bit, an instructional designer can help them make some decisions. Now, after all that, and you put it all together, two things have to happen. The first is, okay, does your classroom have the tech that you need? Let's ask that question afterwards. And really, if you just had a laptop with a webcam, you could probably handle that part. It'd be great if you had fully wired Zoom-enabled classrooms, but if you don't, you can, I think, pretty much make it work with a laptop. We use a lot of Owls at Plymouth State. Those work pretty well too, if you need to, for a sort of cheaper, faster, more portable wired classroom.
What's an Owl? Is that like a camera that follows you?
Yeah, it follows you. It's actually originally made for like conference situations, like 360 kind of view, but costs about $800, and you can get a reasonably okay Zoom-enabled classroom out of an Owl and a laptop.
Okay. Very cool.
So you do that, and then I think the other part after getting the technology in place is that you have to just get faculty feeling the permission to make the decisions that they need to about how they're going to organize their class in a way that's probably not going to look too much like it used to look in terms of delivery. And again, I'll share with you the link to these highly flexible models that Martha Burtis designed. And they basically, I think, give you 4 different options from the traditional regimented HyFlex that allow for flexibility with modality without the whole do it both at once kind of idea.
So I only have 2 questions left, which is good because this has been fantastic, and I've already taken my hour with you. But okay, so one question is, as we mediate more of our activities online, we produce digital material, and so it becomes an opportunity to work with students on a digital e-portfolio. What are your thoughts on, one, how that connects to HyFlex, but also how does that connect to a student's career in school and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, Tim, you've just asked a question that will take another
hour. Okay, all right.
This is what I really love to talk about, because my real area of interest and expertise is not in. I mean, it's a colossal joke that I get called to talk about HyFlex now, because basically my advice for HyFlex is like, please don't do that. Don't do that. What I love though is when you start working with flexible modalities and getting online a little bit more and thinking about the affordances of technology, not just how you can replicate your old life as a face-to-face teacher, but what's really different. We realize that we are producing work, research, educational materials, content that we can now share more broadly to expand access to ideas, access to knowledge. So this gets to my whole interest as an open educator in helping to involve our students in the building of the knowledge commons. So when I make stuff now, so like the first thing I'd say is like, Tim, I hope you're openly licensing this podcast so that people can take a little chunk of it and drop it into their digital textbook on HyFlex Learning.
I'll make a point with this episode.
Yay!
CC0. All right.
So I talk with a lot of faculty about that. If you're going to be using, for example, online materials, because now you're projecting them through Zoom and, whatever, could we openly license that and make it available to other folks? Could we find openly licensed materials? Like I had one when we made the first COVID pivot. There was a gentleman, I won't even say his discipline, but he's in the sciences, and he ran into my office and he was like, I need to record like 12 hours of lectures for my course. Like, It has to be that way. And I said, okay, fine. Like, here's this pop-up studio you can use, and here's how you record it. I also want to show you that somebody's already recorded, chunked up, added graphics, right? This guy was just going to record 12 one-hour lectures of him standing in front of a board. But somebody who loves making videos in his field had made really cute, interactive, wonderful content for all the stuff he wanted to use. I said, if you want, you could skip those 12 hours, use this guy's materials, and then go ahead and build the rest of your course around that. And he was, of course, like, wow, he didn't know it existed. So I think there's a lot of benefits, and getting students to become producers in that commons, not just absorbers or consumers of that information. So most of my students build not just e-portfolios, but websites through Domain of One's Own. They all get their own domains when they come in. And if they choose to work on the web, they put their research, they put their ideas all there as part of them, building whatever digital footprints they want. Sometimes they don't, but if they do, it can be really helpful. I also try to do that as connected with a connected learning approach. So I try to introduce them to the scholars who are working in their fields, reading the journals daily that are coming through their Twitter feeds, that kind of stuff. So that as they're producing, they're in conversation with current stuff that's happening in their fields. I think we need to stop thinking about our fields as static repositories that we can somehow download to our students and help them understand that they're entering a lifelong learning journey by becoming somebody in a field. And the digital world is really helpful for that. It's much easier to do that when you can show them that unfolding. Before, how are you going to do that? You have to take them every year to a conference. Now they can see every day what it means to be a working scholar. So I love that about digital learning and connected learning, and it can all be a part of this new environment.
I promised you only one last question, but I have a follow-up. Domain of One's Own, is that a service, or is that what you call it? Or
yeah. So again, my genius colleague Martha Burtis, who created these highly flexible models, she was one of the folks at the University of Mary Washington who started an initiative called Domain of One's Own. It's now an independent company. Martha works with me, but the company is under the guidance of Jim Groom. And it's in about 150 institutions in the United States. And it really is just a process by which students in certain programs, or when they come into the college, get a URL that's connected to their college. But it's just blank server space. So they learn how to, install their site, build it. It's basically a movement away from a drag and drop, like headshot e-portfolio, right, to more of a working scholar site, and also a little bit about digital literacy, helping students to understand, like, how am I using the web? Why am I using the web? Do I understand privacy on the web? Do I understand what makes this tick? Yeah. So it's a wonderful program that you can join. It's pretty inexpensive. You can join it institutionally. But if not, there's lots of people who kind of hack around by having students use Google sites, or you just build a blog on a free
WordPress
service
or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this really is the last question, and I'm afraid it might be an hour. So brace yourself. So COVID caused this tsunami where everybody out, and now there's this tension, everybody back in, and now we're kind of sloshing around in HyFlex. What does the world look like in 10 years in higher ed?
Oh, well, I will say the work that inspires me in higher ed is about public infrastructure. I feel like a pandemic has helped many of us understand public health in a different way. Oh gosh, it actually isn't enough if I hoard all the hand sanitizer and get vaccinated. My life is still going to suck until we get a handle on this globally. Higher ed, I think, is at a similar, we're in a sort of a similar defining crucible for higher ed, which is we need to understand that if everything moves to a privatized model, if we continue to defund, if we continue to paywall all of our academic research, if we continue to make higher ed something that only middle class or wealthy people can afford, that we are going to lose the ability to go back, to a place where higher ed could have served a role in the public good. So I guess what I say is I get up every day trying to say, how can I do my daily work in a way that values a public approach to learning, an equitable approach to learning. And maybe that will move us in that direction in the same way that maybe COVID will move us to take a true public health stance. But the other option is that we privatize higher education, that we hoard vaccines and try to pretend like there's a magical viral gate around the United States that, keeps us safe. Right now, I would say the energy is in the wrong direction, for public health, for public education. But there's a lot of us working who know the benefits if we were to all take a more common approach. So I don't know where we'll be in 10 years. I think it'll either be a little bit better or a lot worse.
Robin, thank you so much for being on the show. This was terrific.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
My guest today was Dr. Robin DeRosa. A link to Robin's website, robinderosa.net, will be in the show notes, along with the additional links that she's spoken about in the show. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.